Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked on Wolves. The Timberwolves take on the Pistons tonight. We will preview that game. However, I want to spend most of the show talking about some trade possibilities, some rumors regarding teams interested in players on the Timberwolves roster, players the Timberwolves might be willing to trade, names that they've apparently discussed that they could get back. Lots of stuff with the Boston Celtics, some other teams out there interested in Timberwolves players. We're going to cover all that today on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked on Wolves.
You are Locked on Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked on Wolves podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked on Wolves. I'm also the editor of Dunking with Wolves, the Timberwolves site on the Fansided Network. Happy Thursday, everybody, and happy Timberwolves game day. The Timberwolves are at Detroit tonight to take on the lowly Pistons for the first time this season. Then they turn around and face them again at home this weekend. So we will preview that game. However, on the show today, lots of other stuff to get to, mostly trade deadline related. We are 1 week away from the NBA trade deadline, and the rumors are starting to pick up. Nothing significant in terms of significant names the Wolves are looking to acquire, but lots of smaller stuff, including a couple pretty big contracts that Timberwolves are apparently open to moving, and also some teams that they've apparently discussed these trades with. So I want to talk about all that, give my thoughts on it, where the Timberwolves sit today, just 1 week out from the deadline before we get to Wolves-Pistons. First, though, thank you for making Locked on Wolves your first listen each and every day. Locked on Wolves is available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, Odyssey, anywhere else you like to listen. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked on T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. All right, so let's start with some of the actually a couple of quick notes off the top. I didn't talk about this the other day on the show, but it was shortly before the Timberwolves win on Tuesday night. The NBA had announced the 28 players as part of the Clorox Rising Stars game this year. It's not just one game, it's multiple games. The format's different this year. I'll get to that in a minute. But 12 rookies, 12 sophomores, 4 players from the G League Ignite. There's going to be a draft to separate the teams. So way back in the day, it was rookies versus sophomores. Then it became Team USA versus Team World. And then this year, there will be 4 captains from the ESPN, the 75th anniversary team. And I'm not going to remember them off the top of my head, but Gary Payton is one. James Worthy is one. Rick Barry is one. And I'm blanking on who the 4th one is. But they're going to draft teams. Each team is going to have, I believe, 7 players. 28 divided by 4, 7, or yeah, 28 divided by 4, 7 players. They'll play 2 games to 50 points, similar to what they did last year in the rookie sophomore game, or I guess that was in the All-Star game last year, the pandemic year. And then the winners of those games will play a game to 25 points to declare the winner. So it's like a mini tournament that'll happen on All-Star Friday night. All that to say, Anthony Edwards and Jade McDaniels were both named as 2 of the sophomores, the 2 of the 12 sophomores that were named to play in the game. Of course, the Wolves didn't have any rookies playing in the game. So that should be a lot of fun. It'll add a wrinkle and just kind of a different element to the weekend. So that was notable. I wanted to point that out. And then the other thing was, there's a really cool Anthony Edwards feature over at The Undefeated by Mark J. Spears, who wrote just a feature on Anthony Edwards' confidence, how he's becoming known as an NBA star, really, despite he makes a point to talk about the limited national TV exposure for Anthony Edwards. Of course, the Wolves have been on ESPN, I think, once this year, TNT once, and NBA TV once or twice, and that's it to this point in terms of national TV. That's probably going to change here the second half of the season if the Wolves stay above 500. But notably, I mean, Edwards was still in the conversation in terms of all-star voting. He finished top 10 in front court players. He was 10th among West guards. Fans voted him 11th, but the media voted him 7th, and he finished 8th overall among NBA players in all-star voting, which says a lot about the popularity of Edwards at this stage. So if you get a chance, go read that article over at The Undefeated. I thought it was it was a really good read. All right, let's start talking about some of these trade rumors. So this is the stage where teams, frankly, they're just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. certainly in the media. And so we don't know what the motivation here from some of this stuff leaking is. So one of the more minor ones, for instance, you'll recall last week the Timberwolves were rumored to be one of the teams interested in Robert Covington, and the Utah Jazz were the other team that was actively the two teams that were mentioned. I guess there was a third. It was the Wolves, the Jazz, and there was one other team who were very interested in acquiring Robert Covington, along with a handful of other teams. But those are the three most prominent teams interested. Well, the Jazz are also now interested, according to Michael Scotto of Hoops Hype. They're interested in Josh Okogie from the Timberwolves, as well as Josh Richardson from the Celtics, Harrison Barnes from the Kings. So clearly, the Jazz are interested in a defensive-minded forward, somebody who can guard on the perimeter, and it makes sense. I mean, now Joe Ingles is injured; he's out for the season and into next season, which is really obviously sad and disappointing, and hurts the Jazz. Also, it hurts his trade value. He still has an expiring contract. They could still trade him. But a team like the Wolves, who fancies themselves a playoff team, is it worth it for an expiring contract to move on from Josh Okogie, who provides some wing depth, for an injured Joe Ingles just to pick up a pick? Probably not. I don't know if there's much else on the Jazz roster that gets the Timberwolves out of bed, unless the Wolves are so comfortable with their current depth and they feel like Leandro Balmaro could play that defensive wing role in a pinch if it got down to it. Remember, Okogie's not in the regular rotation right now anyway. The Timberwolves are relying primarily on, when D'Angelo Russell's healthy, it's Beverly, it's Russell, it's Jalen Noel, it's Malik Beasley. Those are your top four guys on the wing, and Okogie kind of slides down the depth chart depending on how you want to play. Jordan McLaughlin could play in a two-point guard backcourt. He's been playing better of late than he did earlier this season. So Okogie's not entirely expendable, but if the Wolves feel like they could pick up, a trade asset like a draft pick that they could turn around and flip this summer or even immediately at the deadline by trading Josh Okogie, then great. I don't think that the Jazz are about to spend a first-round pick to get Josh Okogie, who also is on an expiring contract and will be a free agent at the end of the season. So I don't think that's necessarily what's going to happen here, and I don't know that it's worth it for a second rounder. I think Okogie, while not a who you really want in your rotation as a playoff team, he's a very good fringe rotation piece, a 9th, 10th guy. Do you give him up for just a second round pick? He's already an expiring contract. Does that deal make a whole lot of sense? I don't think so. And I'd be surprised if he was traded in a one-off for a draft pick, unless somebody was willing to give up a first rounder, which I don't think will happen. But it's probably not worth it for essentially a salary dump to get a first round or second round pick. Yes, the Wolves are up against the cap, so I guess maybe at the end of the day, if it comes down to it, the Wolves can't do anything else. That's a possibility to comfortably move back a little bit from the luxury tax. The Wolves could do that. I just don't think it's super likely. I think it's more likely he's aggregated as part of a larger deal, which again is, as we'll get to in a minute, I still think is fairly unlikely that a larger deal even happens with the Wolves. So that's one of the newer rumors. Josh Okogie's name hadn't really been out there in an actual rumor yet. I talked about him as mentioned, somebody who could be aggregated with other deals or moved at the last minute in a smaller deal. But we've known that Patrick Beverley is a player that was going to draw interest from around the league, and sure enough, he has. So there's a rumor regarding Patrick Beverley and specifically the Boston Celtics, but also some other teams as well. And so I want to get into that next and talk about the likelihood of somebody not named Anthony Edwards or Karl-Anthony Towns actually being traded. I'm still a little bit dubious that happens, but I want to get into this rumor and some of the players that the Wolves apparently were interested in potentially coming back from Boston if they did make a trade with the Celtics. So we'll do that here next. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before as football continues their march through the playoffs right to the big game here in just a couple of weeks, less than that, week and a half. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season, and it's not just football. BetOnline has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the new amazing offers available for 2022. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, let's go ahead and talk and talk about these other trade rumors. So the Timberwolves are, Jake Fisher of Bleacher Report is reporting that the Timberwolves are exploring Patrick Beverley trade options. Of course, he is a free agent after the season. He's got an expiring contract, and it's I believe it's like 12 million, 14 million, something like that. So it's a pretty significant expiring contract. And That's not a surprise. We've been hearing that since the beginning of the year that the Wolves would be open to trading Beverly. Now, the narrative all along has been they'll trade him if they're not a playoff team, if it, if it makes sense to trade him, if they can get a good return, possibly even sign him back in free agency this offseason. Because remember, there were also extension talks that were rumored back in like November, almost immediately after the season started. Beverly talked about how he liked it in Minnesota. The Timberwolves were interested in keeping him. The Timberwolves realize the positive impact he's had as a positive influence he's had on their younger roster from a both in the locker room and off the floor, and also from a defensive culture standpoint. So it's been anywhere from they'd trade him to we want to extend him, and now as we get closer to the deadline, the Timberwolves are discussing everybody. And this Jake Fisher report was followed up by both Darren Wolfson, of course, of KSTP and Score North in the Twin Cities, and our friend John Krasinski over at The Athletic. Both kind of chimed in on Twitter to the report and said that Sachin Gupta is casting a wide net, was the words that were used, I think, by Doogie Wolfson, and that everybody besides Towns and Edwards is available. That's not a surprise. And also, I should note that both Doogie and John said that they don't expect Patrick Beverley to be traded, which is what I've been saying all along. Yeah, if you have to include him to get a Ben Simmons or maybe even to get a Miles Turner, that's something you'd have that discussion and you would be open to doing that. You're never going to say he's untouchable. That's not how these trade discussions work, unless it's Karl-Anthony Towns or Anthony Edwards. Even D'Angelo Russell, notice his name's not there because, as I've said all along, yes, he's had a really good season and the Wolves have been way better with him on the floor, but the Wolves would have to be open to trading him in the right deal. I don't think he's moved for really anybody except for like a Ben Simmons, which I don't think happens. It's really unlikely, even more unlikely, of course, that D'Angelo Russell's traded than say a Patrick Beverley. If we were to rank the roster in terms of least likely to most likely to be traded, it's Towns. It's probably Edwards and then Towns at this point, honestly. But that I don't want to get into that now. That's a discussion for another day. It's Edwards and Towns are in that first tier of not being traded, almost for sure not being traded. In that next category would be D'Angelo Russell, and I'd even put Jared Vanderbilt in that category because he's a complete bargain at his contract. The reason why Russell's there and not in the first tier is because his contract isn't a bargain. He's not a max player. He is not quite an all-star player, although he's much closer this year because he's chosen to play some defense and he's done some stuff besides shoot. Even though the shooting numbers aren't as good this year, he's distributed the ball better. He's played better defense. He's been an all-around better player than he was certainly the last couple of years. So all that to say, it's pretty unlikely Russell's traded, but he's going to be in the conversation. The Patrick Beverley thing is interesting. And then the Celtics thing that I alluded to earlier, this is a report that was first made by Jared Weiss of The Athletic, and then John Krasinski, of course, also The Athletic, but based in Minnesota, chimed in and agreed that the Celtics had explored a deal earlier this year that would have acquired Malik Beasley from Minnesota. And the main piece coming back to the Timberwolves would have been Josh Richardson, along with one of either Romeo Langford or Aaron Nesmith. Minnesota wasn't interested because, this is according to this report from The Athletic, they were right up against the tax and wanted roster flexibility for potential bigger deadline moves later. So let me break this down just a little bit. So as we get closer to the deadline, that type of a deal is a real possibility if Boston wants to do it. I'm not really sure why they'd want to. Beasley's obviously not had a good season. Neither really has any of those other guys. I mean, you could argue that because he's a better defender, that Richardson has certainly had a better season than Beasley, and I think that's why the Wolves would be entertaining this. And I'll get to the Wolves' perspective here in a minute. But if the Celtics, who are still a fringe playoff team in the East and have been disappointing this year, if they really want to acquire Malik Beasley, this is not a bad deal for the Timberwolves. And the Celtics, of course, looking for a punch offensively that they've been lacking really. I mean, what is their offense rank so far this year? They're 19th in offense, but they're top 5 in defense. So swapping out a guy who's a little bit of a better defender in Josh Richardson for a Malik Beasley, who of course is going to be all offense, is a way to kind of balance that out and add some offense while sacrificing just a little bit of defense. Because in that scenario, they probably hang on to Marcus Smart, for instance, and most of the rest of their guys that are really good defenders. So that might make some sense from their perspective. If I'm the Timberwolves and I can get Marcus Smart, or excuse me, not Marcus Smart, and I can get Josh Richardson, it's something I'd look at. I'd take a hard look at. The reason why the Wolves would be worried about flexibility is because Josh Richardson still has one more year on his contract. He's under contract through next season. And I mean, remember when he was the centerpiece, essentially, along with draft picks of the Jimmy Butler trade between Miami and Philadelphia just a few years ago. Um, or I guess he was discussed I mean, that was really kind of the thing, right? Is Miami was sending Josh Richardson to Philadelphia. Jimmy Butler was ultimately going to Miami. And he was seen as at the time, 25 years old, coming off a really promising season in Miami where he averaged almost 17 points a game, shot 36% from three, and was kind of seen as this two-way player, almost in some ways, a Jimmy Butler light or a younger version of Jimmy Butler. And then he was really disappointed in Philadelphia. He had a decent year last year in Dallas, but was not very good in Philadelphia. And then he's been okay this year in Boston, but he's not even starting for the Celtics. So for the Timberwolves to be able to acquire Richardson and give up Malik Beasley, that actually makes a lot of sense with what the MO for the Timberwolves has been for much of this year. For a defensive-minded team to add a Josh Richardson. And by the way, even though he shot 33.5% over the last two seasons from three with Philadelphia and Dallas, this year for Boston, Josh Richardson shooting 39% from three, which is a career high if you throw out his rookie season when he didn't play all that much. But he's a career 36% shooter from three, so it's not like he can't shoot. He's just not likely that star ceiling guy we thought he was a few years ago. So if the Timberwolves were to trade Malik Beasley and bring back Josh Richardson, who's got a year left on his deal, is more of a 3-and-D type player, would be just fine coming off the bench. It's what he's been doing all season. I mean, you have to take a hard look at that. And the other guys are basically throw-ins. But I was a big Aaron Nesmith fan coming out of college before last season, the same draft as Anthony Edwards. Supposed to be a sharpshooter type guy. He struggled this year with his shot in inconsistent minutes. Langford is less appealing to me, but kind of a similar story there. He's more defensive minded than Nesmith. But to add one of those guys in addition, that's not the worst thing. Now, the flexibility piece is because if the Timberwolves can move Beasley in a larger deal for a bigger name guy, again, throwing these names out there, haven't been mentioned again recently, but a Miles Turner, a Ben Simmons, perhaps it's a Harrison Barnes, something like that. Whereas the team acquiring the Timberwolves players back would be more interested in Beasley as not an expiring contract, but a large contract with some flexibility because he's got next year and he's also got the team option on the following year. So if a team believes Beasley could bounce back, Beasley's not a bad play in terms of he could even be a bargain contract if he plays like he did for much of last year when he was healthy and before he was suspended. Then you figure you've got next year and you potentially have another year and he becomes a valuable trade chip. If he plays okay, but not great, then he's basically an expiring contract next year when you turn around and flip him. So the Beasley contract is going to be seen as attractive on the trade market at this point, even though he's not had a great season. The question is for the Timberwolves, when do you pull the trigger? Do you hang on to him and try and recoup some value? Do you believe in this semi-hot streak he's had recently? And do the Timberwolves want to reap the benefits of a strong finish to the season? And they could always trade him this offseason. All the same caveats I just mentioned apply. Teams could see him as, oh, this is a bargain for the next 2 years with an out after this year. If we don't like what we've seen, we could flip him, and he's essentially an expiring contract, before a team would have to pick up the option heading into the 23-24 season. But as soon as the Wolves trade him, there's less flexibility, and then they're kind of locked into Richardson for another year. Now, obviously, the same rules apply there, where he'd be an expiring contract for next season. But Beasley, again, probably has equal, if not a little bit greater trade value at this moment. So all that to say, that trade actually makes a lot of sense in my mind. Beasley for Richardson with the throw in there on the side. So I don't know. I mean, that's kind of the first realistic trade that seems palatable to me regarding Beasley. So keep an eye on that. Again, the reporting from John Krasinski at The Athletic is that Timberwolves weren't interested at the time, but we don't necessarily know, when does that flip? When does that become a more realistic option for Minnesota? At this point, there's 3 games, maybe 4 games before the deadline. So the Timberwolves want to see how Beasley continues to play over the next week. Perhaps at the deadline, he's played well enough over the last week that they can squeeze an extra draft pick out of somebody if they choose to trade him. But that's the latest on him. And then the last thing was another Celtics related thing and also Patrick Beverly related. Jake Fisher, Bleacher Report, mentioned that the Timberwolves would be open or would be interested in acquiring Marcus Smart if they were to move Patrick Beverly somewhere else. The Celtics could move Smart for an expiring contract and a first-round pick, is what Jake Fisher, Bleacher Report, says. Now, I talked about Smart several weeks ago on this show. I don't think that the Wolves would really obviously they'd be interested in the idea of Marcus Smart and what he could do on the floor. He's a phenomenal defender, but that contract would be really rough for a Timberwolves team that's already up against the cap. Smart, remember, just signed the extension. So he's got, what does he have? Like 4 years left on his deal. He signed the extension not that long. I think it was this offseason. Yeah, it was in August. And after this year, he's got 4 more years, starting at 16.6 million next year, going all the way up to 21.3 million in the 25-26 season. That's a lot of money to pay a guy, even if he is, an all defensive team guy, and he is. But it's a lot of money to pay a guy who shoots 32% from 3 and 40% from the floor, and is only going to put up 10 points, 5 assists per game. Um, for the Wolves, who already have all this money tied up into Towns, Russell, Edward, and eventually Edwards, he's going to get his money, right? Towns will be extension eligible. Russell is a free agent after next year. Does Marcus Smart make sense to pay 15, 16, $18 million to? I don't think so. I'd be really surprised if the Timberwolves acquired Smart. Now, he would backfill a lot of what you'd be giving up if you traded Patrick Beverley, but at a much higher price. And ultimately you lose that flexibility than if you're the Wolves, if you add him onto your book. So I'd be surprised if Marcus Smart was an acquisition that the Timberwolves made, even if they traded Patrick Beverley. My guess is that's more Celtics chatter than anything else, trying to increase some trade value on their end. So lots of chatter out there, super interesting. Sitting here right now, which is still a week out, I would still be surprised if the Timberwolves did something outside of a very minor tweak like a Josh Okogie trade or dumping Jake Layman on a team to give themselves a little bit more breathing room. Something like that. The Timberwolves know they have Leandro Balmaro deep on the bench. Jalen Noel's playing better. So they have a little bit more depth at the end of the roster, because as we get towards the end of the season and of course into the playoffs, that rotation tightens up so much that the depth becomes a little bit less important once you get that deep into the season, if that makes sense. And so I think they would consider moving in a Kogi, a Layman. There's another name I'm blanking on right now, but I don't think there's anything like major that happens. And if I had to bet right now, I would bet against Malik Beasley being traded. But again, anything can happen in the next week. And my guess is if he plays better over the next week than he has, it's almost more likely that he gets traded, frankly. Okay. Let's close the show by looking at Wolves-Pistons. The Timberwolves have not seen Detroit this year, so I want to look at that matchup. First, though, let's talk about our friends over at rockauto.com. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. With the ever-increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts you need. Why endure often pointless or seemingly intimidating questioning and wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer, choosing the only brand their warehouse happens to carry? You have computers with access to rockauto.com, both at home and in your pocket. Save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why spend 30%, 50%, even 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? For example, a Honda Odyssey, the fuel pump is $353 from a chain store. It's only $216 at Rock Auto. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. They have everything you could possibly need, from brake parts to tail lamps, motor oil to new carpet. Go explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto part needs. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. Right, Locked On in their How Did You Hear About Us box, so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. Forgot to mention this earlier. Another thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen. A reminder about the NBA trade deadline show. The trade deadline, of course, is next Thursday, the 10th at 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. The Locked On NBA podcast will be covering it live from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Central. That's 2 to 4 Eastern. Join Kim Becker, John Corrales, and Locked On fantasy basketball host, fantastic Josh Lloyd, to get analysis of every blockbuster move. Subscribe to Locked On NBA YouTube and turn your notifications on so you know when they go live. All right, let's talk about Wolves-Pistons. So Detroit obviously has been mostly as expected this year, unlike, say, I don't know, the Cleveland Cavaliers that have been way better than anybody thought. Detroit's done exactly what we expected. They're 12-38. They're second to last in the Eastern Conference. They have gotten a little bit healthier of late, though. They've gotten back Jeremy Grant, who missed several weeks with an injury. Cade Cunningham is questionable for this game. He tweaked, I think it was a hip on Tuesday. Did not return to the game, but didn't stay back in the locker room. It seems pretty likely he plays against the Wolves Thursday night. He's questionable. Kelly Olynyk is back after missing. He's played like 3 of the last 5 games after missing an extended period of time due to injury. So they've got a couple of these veteran guys like Grant and Olynyk back to help some of their depth. Now, Maybe not so coincidentally, those guys are back right before the trade deadline, so who knows how much longer they'll actually be in Detroit. But it's likely that that Olynyk plays. Jeremy Grant should play in this game. He came back and played Tuesday for the first time in a long time. So that certainly helps Detroit's depth. However, they're still 29th in offensive rating this season. They're 23rd in defensive rating. Cade Cunningham has been better defensively than he has been offensively, but anticipating that he plays in this game, he's shooting under 40% from the field, 33% from three, but it's still been a lot of fun, including the game in which he got hurt. He's averaging 16 points a game, over 5.5 rebounds and 5 assists per game as well. The Detroit still has some nice pieces. I mean, obviously Isaiah Stewart, who was a rookie last year, is a really impressive big man, and he's been a lot of fun. Luke Garza has been a pleasant surprise as a rookie for them. Of course, the former Iowa Hawkeye. Jeremy Grant has been really good this year. He's kind of been more of a volume scorer. I talked a lot about him. I think it might have been 2 weeks ago on the show as a trade possibility for the Wolves. He's averaging 20 points a game in 25 games this season, but he's been asked to do so much more for Detroit than he ever was in Oklahoma City or Denver in the past in terms of just being a high usage player. His usage rate is far higher than it's ever been. It was very high last year as well. His efficiency has plummeted. He's shooting under 34% from three. Remember, he was essentially a 40% guy a couple of years ago. He's 41.5% from the field overall. And yet he's not distributing, right? He's not an offense initiator. He's essentially just a high volume scorer now that isn't all that efficient. He only averages 2.5 assists per game. And if you look at his assist rate, it's nothing to write home about either. It's just a little over 13%. Jeremy Grant is obviously the guy you have to look out for. You just have to make his life difficult. Same with Cade Cunningham. Make them take difficult shots. Focus on that. And then, Saddiq Bey, actually, I really liked him during the draft process a couple of years ago. And he's been really good this season, has really kind of upped what he's done in terms of offense. He's shooting just 33% from three and under 39% from the field. But he was always supposed to be kind of a 3-and-D guy, and he's shown potentially the ability to do more. His ideal role is probably still more as a 3-and-D role player than it is as somebody who gets as many shots up as he does. But he's a ton of fun. So none of those three, Grant, Cunningham, or Bey, are very efficient, which is why this is the second to worst offensive team in the league. But they all can score in bunches. They all can get hot. They all can shoot threes, and they will shoot threes in this game. So make life difficult for Grant, for Cunningham, for Bey, and you're probably going to be all right in this game. But of course, we know the Timberwolves have had these moments this year where they've lost to teams they shouldn't have lost to. For instance, the Pelicans twice. When things are going well, and it's easy to kind of stumble. Now, this is the first game of a brief of this, or I guess the only game in this really brief road trip before they come home to play Detroit on Sunday. They've got the next 2 days off. They've got the weekend off, Friday, Saturday off. So hopefully the focus is there for Minnesota when they travel to Detroit for this game. Also, notably, and this isn't a surprise because Detroit is 29th in offensive rating, but they're not really all that great at anything. They're 29th in three-point shooting percentage. They do get to the free throw line a fair amount. They're top 10 in free throw rate and attempts per game and 13th in free throw percentage. So if you can keep Cunningham, that's the second piece of this. Make life difficult for Cunningham, for Grant, for Bey in terms of the type of shots they're getting. But you have to keep Jeremy Grant off the free throw line. He gets 6 free throw attempts per game, and he's an 85% free throw shooter. So be cognizant of that. Detroit's a bad rebounding team. They're bottom 10 in both defensive rebounding rate and offensive rebounding rate. Having Kelly Olynyk back will help. He's missed a lot of this season, but it's only going to help so much. The Timberwolves have been really good offensively and bad defensive rebounding the ball, although they've been better of late. So no major concerns there for the Wolves. Also, Detroit is the 5th worst team in terms of turnovers. So 25th in the league in turnover rate offensively. The Wolves remain the best team at turning opponents over. So the Wolves should be able to force, 14, 16 turnovers in this game and really make Detroit's offense have to work to get anything. And that to me is going to be the key to this game. If Minnesota could do what they typically do, be disruptive, make them make tough shots and generate turnovers, this should be a game that Timberwolves win fairly easily. I'd imagine, I haven't looked, but I would imagine the betonline.net line is probably Timberwolves by, 6 or 7 or something like that, 7.5, somewhere in that neighborhood, the 6 to 8 range. Because again, this is a game that Timberwolves should win, but they need to be careful. And then they play Detroit at home on Sunday in a matinee. And as we know, if the Wolves look ahead too far, that's when things get a little bit hairy for Minnesota. So at Detroit, this is a 6 p.m. tip, by the way, Central, because it's on the East Coast. That's tonight on Thursday. And then off Friday, Saturday, home for Detroit on Sunday for a matinee. And then back-to-back away games at Sacramento Tuesday, Wednesday of next week. So 4 consecutive games the Wolves will be favored in. They should win all 4. Obviously, that's not a lot easier said than done. It's more likely they go like 3-1 over these 4. But to keep the good vibes going from the big win over Denver Tuesday, this is a very winnable game that's important to put away from Minnesota at Detroit on Thursday. All right, that's all we have for you today. Of course, we'll be back after the game tonight with the post-game podcast, so make sure you're following and subscribe to the show wherever you like to listen. That includes, of course, YouTube, as well as Apple, Google, Spotify, and the all-new Odyssey app. And thank you for those of you that do make Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. If you do listen regularly, if you're subscribed, or if you're a new listener, please help us out with a positive review, especially Apple, YouTube. Leave a comment, like the video, all that good stuff. It definitely helps us out, helps us get in front of more folks. And it's genuinely appreciated. Thank you very much for listening to the show. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. That's all we have for you today. Thanks again for listening to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Also, while you're making Locked On Wolves your first listen, a reminder to make your second listen Locked On Bets. It's your daily one-stop shop for all your gambling needs. Locked On Bets is hosted by your boy Q with expert analysis and insight from Lee Sterling. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.